The dust devil rose on the horizon like a warning, but Jake Mercer barely noticed as he drove his spurs into the flanks of his buckskin mare, his mind fixed on only one thing. Sarah Whitmore was dying, and he had the medicine that could save her life. The year was 1883, and the Texas plains stretched endlessly in every direction from the small settlement of Copper Ridge, a collection of weathered buildings that clung to existence in the unforgiving landscape. Jake had been working cattle on the northern range when Tommy Whitmore, Sarah's younger brother, had found him 3 hours past dawn. The boy's face had been streaked with tears and dust, his horse lathered and trembling from the hard ride. Sarah had taken ill with fever, he said, burning up something fierce, and Doc Henderson had ridden clear to Austin 2 days prior for medical supplies. Their ma had died of the same fever 5 years back, and now Sarah was the only woman in the Whitmore household, caring for Tommy and their father ever since. Jake had known Sarah Whitmore for 7 years, ever since she was 18 and he was 21, fresh off a cattle drive from Kansas. She had been serving plates at the boarding house back then, her auburn hair always neatly pinned, her green eyes bright with intelligence and a stubborn independence that most men in town found off-putting. Jake had found it captivating. Over the years, they had developed a careful friendship, the kind where words were often unnecessary, where a shared glance across the general store could convey more than an hour of conversation. He had never told her how he felt, had never found the courage to speak the words that sat heavy in his chest during the long nights on the range. There had always been time, he had told himself. There had always been tomorrow. Now tomorrow might never come. Doc Henderson's wife had given Jake the quinine powder without hesitation, her wrinkled hands pressing the small wrapped package into his palm with a whispered prayer. 30 miles separated the Henderson place from the Whitmore ranch, 30 miles of hard Texas prairie baking under an August sun that showed no mercy. Jake had checked his canteen, filled it from the pump, and swung back into the saddle without a moment's consideration of staying put or waiting for cooler evening temperatures. The thought of leaving Sarah to face that fever alone never even crossed his mind. The buckskin was a good horse, steady and strong, but 30 miles was 30 miles and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Jake kept his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. The land rolled in subtle waves, covered in tough prairie grass that had gone yellow in the summer heat, punctuated by mesquite and the occasional lonely cottonwood marking where water might be found. He pushed the mare hard for the first hour, then eased her into a ground-eating lope that would preserve her strength. Every minute counted, but a dead horse would help no one. His thoughts circled back to Sarah as the miles passed beneath the mare's hooves. He remembered the first time he had made her laugh, a real laugh that lit up her whole face. It had been at the church social 4 years ago, when old Jebediah Cole had tried to demonstrate his fiddle-playing skills and had accidentally sent his bow flying into Widow Peterson's punch bowl. Sarah had been serving refreshments, and when the bow had landed with a splash that sent pink liquid cascading over the table, she had met Jake's eyes and they had both dissolved into helpless laughter. Afterward, they had walked together in the cooling evening air, talking about everything and nothing, and Jake had felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he had not known was closed. But Sarah had her responsibilities, and Jake had his work. The ranch he worked for, the Triple Bar, ran cattle across thousands of acres, and the life was hard and uncertain. He had told himself he needed to save more money, to establish himself more firmly, before he could court a woman properly. Sarah deserved stability, deserved more than a cowhand who spent half his life in a saddle and the other half in a bunkhouse. So he had waited and watched, and told himself there would be time. The sun climbed higher as Jake rode on. Sweat darkened the buckskin's neck and flanks, and he could feel the mare's breathing deepen with effort. He stopped once at a creek he knew, letting the horse drink sparingly while he refilled his canteen and splashed water over his face and neck. The coolness was a brief blessing before the heat reclaimed him. He pulled the quinine package from his saddlebag and checked it, making sure it remained dry and intact, then secured it again and remounted. 20 more miles to go, maybe a bit less. The sun said it was near noon. As he rode, Jake found himself praying, something he had not done much since his own mother had passed when he was 15. He was not sure he knew the right words anymore, but he spoke them anyway, inside his mind where only God could hear. Let her be strong enough. Let me get there in time. Let her live. The words became a rhythm that matched the mare's hoofbeats, a desperate litany that carried him forward. The landscape shimmered with heat, and once Jake thought he saw riders on the horizon, but they vanished like ghosts, and he decided they had been a mirage. His throat was dry despite the water, and his shirt clung to his back. The mare's pace had slowed slightly, and he could feel her tiring beneath him, but he urged her on with gentle words and the pressure of his legs. She responded gamely, her ears flicking back to catch his voice, trusting him as horses do when they have been partners for years. He thought about the last time he had seen Sarah, just 5 days ago in town. She had been coming out of the general store with packages in her arms, and he had been heading in. He had held the door for her, and she had smiled that particular smile she reserved for him, the one that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. They had talked for a few minutes about inconsequential things, the weather, the upcoming harvest dance, the new schoolteacher who had arrived from Missouri. He had wanted to ask if she would save him a dance, but old Sam Crawford had come out behind her and the moment had passed. Jake had watched her walk away, her skirts swaying, and had felt that familiar ache of opportunity missed. Not this time, he promised himself as the buckskin carried him across a dry wash. If she lived, if he got there in time, he would tell her everything. He would not waste another moment pretending that what he felt was anything less than love. The sun was past its peak when Jake spotted the first landmark that told him he was entering Whitmore territory, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a pointing finger. 10 miles left, maybe less. The mare was laboring now, her head lower, her breathing hard. He slowed her to a walk for 15 minutes, letting her recover slightly, though every instinct screamed at him to run. A broken horse would doom them both, and Sarah with them. When he urged the mare back into a lope, she responded, though he could feel the effort it cost her. "Good girl," he murmured, leaning forward in the saddle, "just a little further. We are almost there." The Whitmore ranch appeared like a promise on the horizon, the simple house and barn and corrals that represented everything normal and safe in this hard country. Jake could see horses in the corral and a wagon near the barn, but no people moving around. His heart clenched. He pushed the buckskin into a final gallop, and the mare gave him everything she had left, her hooves thundering across the hard-packed earth. He pulled up in front of the house in a cloud of dust, hitting the ground before the mare had fully stopped. His legs were stiff from the saddle, but he forced them to work, grabbing the saddlebag and running for the door. It opened before he reached it, and Thomas Whitmore stood there, his weathered face drawn with fear and exhaustion. "Jake," he said, and there was such hope in that single word that Jake felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. "I have the medicine," Jake said, his voice rough from dust and disuse. "How is she bad?" Thomas said simply, stepping aside. "Doc still is not back." "We have been doing what we can, but the fever just keeps rising." Jake followed the older man through the dim interior of the house. It was clean but sparse, the furniture handmade and practical. They passed through the main room and down a short hallway to a bedroom where the door stood open. The smell of sickness hung in the air, and Jake's stomach tightened with fear. Sarah lay in a narrow bed, covered with a light sheet despite the heat. Her face was flushed with fever, her hair damp and tangled on the pillow. Young Tommy sat in a chair beside the bed, a wet cloth in his hands, looking up with desperate eyes as Jake entered. Jake moved to the bedside, his earlier exhaustion forgotten. Sarah's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and rapid. He touched the back of his hand to her forehead and nearly jerked it back. She was burning up, the heat radiating from her skin like she was on fire from within. "We need water," Jake said, turning to Thomas. "Clean and cool as you can get it, and a cup or spoon." Thomas nodded and hurried out. Tommy remained frozen in his chair, staring at his sister. Jake knelt beside the bed, bringing himself level with Sarah's face. "Sarah," he said softly. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. A small sound escaped her lips, something between a moan and a sigh. "I am here," Jake continued, reaching out to brush a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "I brought the medicine. You are going to be all right." Thomas returned with a pitcher of water and a cup. Jake opened the package of quinine powder, his hands steady despite the fear churning in his gut. Doc Henderson's wife had told him the dosage, and he measured it carefully into the cup, then added water and stirred it with his finger. The mixture was bitter, he knew, but it was Sarah's best chance. "We need to get her to drink this," Jake said. "Help me lift her a bit." Thomas and Jake carefully raised Sarah to a half-sitting position, supporting her between them. Her head lolled and Jake's heart hammered in his chest. He brought the cup to her lips. "Sarah," he said firmly, "you need to drink this, please." Her lips parted slightly and Jake tipped the cup, letting a small amount of the bitter liquid enter her mouth. She choked, tried to turn away, but Jake persisted gently. "I know it tastes awful," he said, "but you have to drink it. Please, Sarah, for me." Perhaps it was his voice or perhaps some deep instinct for survival, but Sarah swallowed. Jake gave her more, patient and careful, until half the cup was gone. That would be enough for the first dose, he thought. They could give her more in a few hours. They laid her back down and Jake sat in the chair Tommy had vacated, unwilling to leave her side. Thomas stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You rode 30 miles in this heat," the older man said finally. It was not a question, Jake nodded, not taking his eyes from Sarah's face. "She would have done the same for any of us." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That is true enough." He cleared his throat. "There is coffee on the stove and beans if you are hungry. You should eat something in a while," Jake said. "I want to make sure the medicine takes hold first." Thomas nodded and withdrew, taking Tommy with him. Jake heard their low voices in the other room, but he focused on Sarah. He dipped the cloth in the water basin beside the bed and wrung it out, then gently wiped her face and neck, trying to cool the fever. Her skin was so hot it seemed impossible, and fear gnawed at him. What if the medicine did not work? What if he had been too slow? He forced the thoughts away. The medicine would work. Sarah would recover. She had to. As the afternoon wore into evening, Jake maintained his vigil. He gave Sarah water whenever she would take it, continued to bathe her face and arms with cool cloths, and watched for any sign of change. Thomas brought him coffee and food, which Jake ate mechanically, barely tasting it. Young Tommy came to the door several times, his young face pinched with worry, and Jake tried to give him reassuring smiles that felt like lies on his lips. It was near sunset when Sarah's breathing changed, becoming deeper and more regular. Jake leaned forward, his hand finding hers beneath the sheet. Her fingers were limp in his grasp, but they seemed perhaps slightly less burning than before. He pressed his palm to her forehead and allowed himself a small flicker of hope. The fever had not broken, but it seemed to him that the terrible heat had diminished just slightly. "That is it," he whispered. "Fight it, Sarah. You are stronger than this." As full darkness fell outside the window, Jake lit the lamp on the bedside table, casting a warm glow over the small room. His body ached from the long ride and the tension of the past hours, but he would not leave. Could not leave. He sat back in the chair and kept hold of Sarah's hand as if his grip alone could anchor her to this world. Sometime deep in the night, Sarah stirred. Jake jerked awake, not having realized he had dozed, and leaned forward instantly. Her eyes opened, unfocused and glassy but open. "Sarah," he said. "Can you hear me?" Her gaze wandered, then found his face. Her lips moved and he leaned closer to catch the whisper. "Jake." "Yes," he said, his throat tight. "I am right here." Thirsty, she breathed. He reached for the water pitcher, poured a fresh cup, and supported her head while she drank. She managed several swallows before turning her face away, exhausted by even that small effort. He laid her back gently. You have been very sick, he told her. But the medicine is working. You just need to rest. Her eyes found his again, and something like confusion crossed her features. How did you get medicine? Doc is not here. I rode to his place, Jake said simply. His wife gave me quinine. That is 30 miles, Sarah whispered. Her hand moved weakly, and Jake caught it, holding it between both of his. I know, he said. You rode all that way, she said, and her eyes were filling with tears. For me, Jake felt something break open in his chest. Of course I did, he said, his voice rough. Did you think I would not? A tear slipped down her temple into her hair. I did not know, she whispered. I never knew. He understood then that they had both been waiting, both holding back, both afraid. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I love you, Sarah Whitmore, he said, and the words that had seemed so difficult for so long came easily now, naturally, as if they had been waiting for this moment. I have loved you for years. I should have told you 1,000 times before now. More tears came, but she was smiling, a weak but genuine smile that lit her fevered face. I love you too, she said, so softly he almost missed it. I thought you did not see me that way. Jake gave a shaky laugh. You are all I see. Sarah's eyes drifted closed again, but the smile remained on her lips. Jake sat back, keeping hold of her hand, and felt as though he could breathe properly for the first time in hours. The fever had not broken yet, but it would. He could feel the change in her, a strength returning that had been ebbing away. The medicine was working, and Sarah was fighting, and love, it turned out, was its own kind of medicine. He gave her another dose of quinine near midnight, and she took it without protest, trusting him. By the small hours of the morning, when the world was at its darkest and quietest, Sarah's fever broke. Jake felt it happen, the sudden cooling of her skin, the way her body seemed to relax into genuine healing sleep rather than the restless tossing of illness. He checked her temperature with his hand, then checked again to be sure, and the relief that flooded through him was so intense it left him shaking. He bowed his head over their joined hands and offered a prayer of thanks, his voice breaking on the words. She would live. Sarah would live. When dawn light began to filter through the window, Thomas appeared in the doorway. He looked at Jake, then at his daughter, and something in the older man's face softened. The fever broke, Jake said. Thomas nodded slowly. You saved her life, Jake shook his head. The medicine saved her. I just brought it. Thomas came into the room and stood looking down at his sleeping daughter. You rode 30 miles through the worst heat of summer without a thought for yourself, he said. You stayed with her all night. Do not try to tell me that was just neighborly concern. Jake met the older man's eyes and saw understanding there and something more, perhaps an approval he had not expected. No, sir, he said quietly. It was not. Thomas nodded again. When she is well, you and I will have a conversation about your intentions. Yes, sir, Jake said. I would welcome that. The older man left and Jake remained. Sarah slept peacefully now, her breathing easy, her face relaxed. The worst was over. She would need time to recover her strength, but the danger had passed. Jake finally allowed himself to relax back in the chair, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. He kept hold of Sarah's hand even as his eyes closed and sleep claimed him. He woke to the feeling of fingers moving in his grasp. His eyes opened to find Sarah watching him, and the clarity in her green eyes told him she was truly recovering. Sunlight streamed through the window, telling him it was well into the morning. You are still here, she said, and her voice, though weak, was her own again. Where else would I be? Jake said, straightening in the chair and wincing at the protest of stiff muscles. Taking care of your horse, probably, Sarah said with a trace of her usual humor. That poor animal must have been exhausted after carrying you 30 miles, Jake grinned. Your father took care of her last night. She is fine, probably eating her weight in oats right now. Good, Sarah said. She paused, and he saw color come into her cheeks that had nothing to do with fever. Did you mean it? What you said last night, every word, Jake said without hesitation. I meant every word. Sarah's smile was like sunrise. Then I suppose you had better sit closer, because I am not letting you leave this room until you tell me again. Jake moved from the chair to sit on the edge of the bed, and Sarah shifted over to make room despite her weakness. He took both her hands in his. "I love you, Sarah Whitmore," he said clearly. "I have loved you for 7 years, and I will love you for the rest of my life if you will let me." "That seems fair," Sarah said, her eyes bright with tears again, "since I plan to love you for at least that long." Jake leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, mindful of her fragility. "When I thought I might lose you," he said against her skin, "I realized I had wasted so much time being afraid and waiting for the perfect moment. There is no perfect moment. There is only now." "Then let us not waste any more time," Sarah said. "When I am well, we will do this properly." "Yes," Jake agreed, "when you are well." In the days that followed, Sarah's recovery progressed steadily. Jake stayed at the Whitmore ranch, sleeping in the barn and spending his days helping Thomas and Tommy with the work that had been neglected during Sarah's illness. But every spare moment he had, he spent with Sarah, sitting beside her bed and then, as she grew stronger, helping her walk around her room and eventually out to the porch where she could sit in the shade and breathe fresh air. They talked during those hours, truly talked in a way they never had before. Sarah told him about how scared she had been that she would die like her mother had, leaving her father and brother alone. Jake told her about the panic he had felt when Tommy had found him, the way his heart had seemed to stop beating until he knew she would live. They spoke of the years they had danced around each other, both too cautious or too fearful to reach for what they wanted. "I kept thinking I was not good enough," Jake admitted one afternoon as they sat on the porch, Sarah bundled in a chair despite the summer heat, still regaining her strength. Just a cowhand with nothing to offer, Sarah had turned to him with fire in her still pale face. "Jake Mercer, you rode 30 miles in brutal heat to save my life. You did not hesitate. You did not think about yourself for even a moment. If that is not enough, then I do not know what is." He had kissed her then, properly, their first real kiss, and it had been everything he had imagined and more. Sweet and gentle and full of promise. Doc Henderson returned 2 days after Sarah's fever broke, full of apologies for his absence. When he examined Sarah and heard the story of her illness and recovery, he nodded approvingly at Jake's quick action with the quinine. "You saved her life, young man," the doctor said. "Another day and we might have lost her." Jake shook the doctor's hand but said nothing. He did not need to be thanked for doing what his heart had demanded. 3 weeks after Sarah's illness, Jake had that promised conversation with Thomas Whitmore. They stood in the barn, ostensibly checking on a mare that was due to foal, but both men knew what the real purpose was. "I want to marry your daughter," Jake said, direct as always. "I know I am just a working cowhand right now, but I have been saving my pay for years. I have enough to buy some land, start a small herd. It will not be easy at first, but I will work hard and I will take care of her." Thomas regarded him steadily. "You proved what kind of man you are when you rode 30 miles through the heat without a second thought." He paused. "Sarah is her own woman, stubborn and strong-minded. She will not want to be just taken care of. You understand that?" Jake smiled. "I know exactly who Sarah is, sir. That is why I love her." Thomas extended his hand. "Then you have my blessing." Jake shook it, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He found Sarah in the kitchen where she was kneading bread dough, her strength nearly fully returned. She looked up when he entered and something in his face made her smile. "So?" she asked. "So," Jake said, crossing to her and taking her flour-dusted hands in his. "Will you marry me, Sarah Whitmore?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, yes, yes." He kissed her there in the kitchen, not caring that Tommy came in and made gagging noises, or that Thomas appeared in the doorway with a knowing smile. Jake had never been happier in his life. They were married in September of 1883 in the small church in Copper Ridge. Sarah wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her slender frame. Jake wore his best suit, borrowed from the Triple Bar foreman since he did not own one himself. The church was full of people from the surrounding ranches and the town, all of whom had heard the story of the cowboy who had ridden 30 miles to save his love. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed Sarah with all the pent-up emotion of the years they had waited and the fear they had overcome. The congregation cheered, and even old Jebediah Cole played his fiddle without sending the bow flying. Jake had bought 200 acres of land bordering the Whitmore ranch, with a creek running through it and good grass for cattle. Thomas had given them a dozen head as a wedding gift, and Jake's savings had bought another 20. It was a modest start, but it was theirs. Together with Tommy's help, Jake built a house, nothing fancy but solid and well-made, with a porch facing east so Sarah could watch the sunrise while she had her morning coffee. Their first year of marriage was hard work, as Jake had known it would be. They rose before dawn and worked until dark, building their herd, mending fences, breaking horses. But they did it together, and that made all the difference. Sarah was every bit as capable as Jake had known she would be, handling a lasso with the skill of someone raised on a ranch, and managing their small household with efficiency. At night, they would sit on their porch and watch the stars come out over the Texas plains, and Jake would hold Sarah close and think about how close he had come to losing her. In those moments, he would tighten his arms around her, and she would turn her face up to his, understanding without words what he was feeling. "I am here," she would say. "We are here. Together." Their first child was born in the summer of 1885. A boy they named Thomas after Sarah's father, but called Tommy Jr. to distinguish him from his uncle. Jake held his son in the early morning light, marveling at the tiny fingers and the way the baby's eyes squinted up at him, and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. Sarah recovered quickly from the birth, her natural strength reasserting itself. She took to motherhood with the same competence she brought to everything else, though Jake noticed the softness that came over her when she nursed their son or sang him to sleep. He would stand in the doorway and watch them, his wife and child, and thank God for that day 2 years ago when he had ridden 30 miles and found the courage to finally speak his heart. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. They bought more land, increased their herd, and built a barn and proper corrals. Jake's reputation as a horseman spread, and people started bringing him animals to train. Sarah kept their books, managed their supplies, and somehow found time to maintain a garden that provided vegetables through the growing season. Tommy, Sarah's brother, spent more time at their place than at his father's, learning the ranching business from Jake and clearly idolizing his brother-in-law. When Tommy turned 20 in 1886, Jake made him a partner in the horse training side of the business, recognizing the young man's natural talent with animals. Their second child arrived in early 1888, a daughter with Sarah's auburn hair and Jake's brown eyes. They named her Elizabeth, after Jake's mother. This time, it was little Tommy Jr., now almost 3, who was fascinated by the baby, wanting to hold her constantly and bringing her flowers from Sarah's garden that were usually more weeds than blooms. Jake watched his family grow and felt a contentment he had never imagined possible. Sometimes, on hot summer days when the dust rose in clouds and the sun beat down mercilessly, he would remember that desperate ride across the Texas plains with medicine in his saddlebag and fear in his heart. He would remember the way Sarah had looked with fever burning through her, how close he had come to losing everything before he had even known he could have it. In those moments, he would find Sarah, wherever she was on the ranch, and pull her into his arms. She always came willingly, seeming to sense when he needed the reassurance of her solid presence. They would stand together, and she would lay her head on his chest, and he would breathe in the scent of her hair and feel his heart settle. By 1890, the Mercer Ranch had grown to over 500 acres with a herd of nearly 300 cattle and a reputation for fine horses that extended across 3 counties. They had built additions onto the house, adding bedrooms for the children and a proper dining room. Sarah's father had moved in with them after a bad fall left him unable to manage his own place, and he spent his days on the porch, entertaining his grandchildren with stories and teaching young Tommy the art of whittling. Jake was 33 now, his face weathered by sun and wind, his body hardened by years of physical work. Sarah, at 30, was more beautiful to him than she had been at 18, her face marked by laughter lines and her body shaped by childbirth. Every change a testament to the life they had built together. One evening in late summer, after the children were asleep and Thomas Sr. had retired to his room, Jake and Sarah sat on their porch as they had done 1,000 times before. The air was finally cooling after another scorching day, and the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about that day?" Sarah asked quietly, her head resting on Jake's shoulder. "Every day," Jake said honestly. "It was the day I stopped being afraid." Sarah turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the last light of the sunset. "I was so sick I barely remember parts of it. But I remember opening my eyes and seeing you there and knowing I was safe." Jake kissed her temple. "You are always safe with me." "I know," Sarah said. "That is what you have given me, Jake. Not just this ranch or this life, though I treasure all of it. But the knowledge that no matter what happens, you will be there. You will never leave." "Never," Jake agreed. "The thought never even crossed my mind that day, and it never will." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness fell and the cicadas began their nightly chorus. Somewhere in the house, one of the children cried out in sleep, and Sarah started to rise, but the crying stopped as quickly as it had begun. She settled back against Jake. "We have been blessed," she said. "Yes," Jake agreed, though blessing seemed too small a word for what they had. They had built something solid and true out of dust and determination and love. They had created a family, a home, a legacy. Their third child, another boy they named Samuel, was born in 1891. This pregnancy had been harder on Sarah, and Jake had spent anxious months worrying, remembering too well what illness looked like on her. But Sarah had come through the birth strong and healthy, and Samuel was a robust baby who seemed determined to keep his parents awake all night with his energetic crying. Young Tommy, now 6, took his role as oldest sibling seriously, helping with Elizabeth and trying manfully to assist with the new baby, though his help sometimes created more work than it saved. Elizabeth, at 3, was a whirlwind of energy and questions, driving everyone to distraction and laughter in equal measure. Jake's days were full of work and noise and responsibility, and he loved every chaotic moment of it. He taught his son to ride, holding him steady in the saddle while Sarah watched with her hand over her heart. He held Elizabeth on his shoulders while he worked, her small hands tangled in his hair, her laughter ringing out across the ranch yard. He walked Samuel at night when the baby would not sleep, pacing the house in darkness and humming old cattle drive songs. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1893, Jake took Sarah into town and bought her a cameo brooch she had admired in the general store window. It was an extravagance they could now afford, and he pinned it to her dress while she protested that he should not have spent the money. "You saved my life," he reminded her. "You gave me a family, a home, a reason to wake up every morning. This brooch does not even begin to repay that debt." "There is no debt," Sarah said, but her eyes were shining. "We saved each other." That night they left the children with Thomas Sr. and Tommy, Sarah's brother, who was now 27 and courting the new schoolteacher, and they rode out to the spot where Jake had built their first house. The structure still stood, though they had long since moved to the larger home. They went inside, where moonlight streamed through the windows, and Jake pulled Sarah into his arms. "You remember our first night here?" he asked. "I remember everything," Sarah said. "I remember thinking we had nothing but each other and this empty land, and wondering if it would be enough, and—" Jake prompted. "It was more than enough," Sarah said. "It was everything." They made love there in the house where they had started their married life, and afterward they lay together on the blanket they had brought, talking quietly until the moon set, and they rode home through the darkness. The years continued to pass, marked by the steady rhythms of ranch life and the growing milestones of their children. Tommy Jr. proved to have his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. Elizabeth developed a passion for reading and convinced her parents to order books from back east, devouring stories of faraway places while remaining firmly rooted in her Texas home. Samuel, as he grew, showed an artistic temperament that puzzled his practical parents but delighted his grandfather, who encouraged the boy's attempts at drawing. Sarah's brother Tommy finally married the schoolteacher in 1895, and they built a house on land adjoining the Mercer ranch. The two families were constantly in and out of each other's homes, and the children grew up more like siblings than cousins. Thomas Sr. passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1897, surrounded by family. They buried him next to his wife on a hill overlooking the ranch, and Jake spoke at the funeral about a man who had trusted him with his daughter's life and had become a father to him in truth. As the new century approached, the Mercer Ranch stood as one of the most prosperous in the county. Jake, now in his early 40s, had silvering hair but remained as strong and capable as ever. Sarah, approaching 40, managed their growing business concerns with a sharp mind and a firm hand. Their children were healthy and thriving, each developing their own strengths and interests. One day in the spring of 1899, Jake was working with a young horse in the corral when he saw Sarah coming across the yard with a familiar look on her face. He left the horse and went to her, noting the way she held herself, the color in her cheeks, another one. He asked, and could not keep the grin from his face despite his concern. Sarah laughed. "At my age, can you believe it? Doc Henderson says I am perfectly healthy, but I am going to be an old mother with a baby. You are not old," Jake said firmly, pulling her close. "And this baby will be as loved as all the others." Their fourth child, a daughter they named Grace, was born in December of 1899, arriving just as the old century gave way to the new. The birth went smoothly despite Sarah's age, and Grace proved to be a calm, contented baby who seemed happy just to observe the chaos of her large family. As the 20th century began, Jake would sometimes sit on his porch in the evening, Grace sleeping in his arms while Sarah sat beside him and their older children played in the yard before bedtime. He would look out over the land they had built their life on and remember the young cowhand who had ridden desperately across the Texas plains with medicine and hope in his saddlebag. That man had thought he was riding to save a life, and he had been right. But he had not understood then that in saving Sarah, he had also saved himself. She had given him purpose and family and a love that had sustained him through every challenge. Together, they had created something that would outlast them both, a legacy written in the land and in the children who would carry their names and their values forward. Sometimes on hot summer days, when the dust rose and the sun beat down mercilessly, Jake would catch Sarah's eye across the ranch yard, and she would smile at him with perfect understanding. She knew what he was remembering, knew what that day meant to both of them. It was the day when possibility became reality, when waiting ended and living began. "I love you," he would mouth across the distance, and she would mouth it back. The words as true and necessary as they had been on that long-ago night when fever had nearly taken her away from him. The Mercer children grew into adulthood, each finding their own path. Tommy Jr. took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, showing the same dedication and skill his father had brought to building it. Elizabeth went east to college, shocking the community but making her parents proud, and returned with a degree and ideas for modernizing their business practices. Samuel pursued his art while also working the ranch, his sketches and paintings of Western life beginning to gain recognition in galleries in San Antonio and beyond. Grace, the baby, grew into a spirited young woman who could outride most of the ranch hands and had firm opinions about everything. Jake and Sarah aged together, their hair turning silver, their faces etching with the lines of a life fully lived. They still sat on their porch in the evenings, still held hands like newlyweds, still found ways to make each other laugh. Their love had not dimmed with time but had deepened, becoming something solid and unshakable, the foundation upon which everything else was built. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1913, their children threw them a party that brought together people from across the county. There were speeches and toasts, stories told and retold about the cowboy who had ridden 30 miles through dust and heat for love. Jake listened to it all with Sarah's hand in his, and when it was his turn to speak, he stood and looked around at the gathered faces, at the life they had created. 30 years ago, he said, I made a ride that changed my life. But the truth is, the hard part was not the riding. The hard part was all the years before when I was too afraid to tell this woman how I felt. He looked down at Sarah, who was smiling up at him with tears in her eyes. The ride was easy, because leaving was never an option. From the moment I knew she needed me, there was nowhere else I could be. He paused, his voice roughening with emotion. Sarah has given me 30 years of love, 4 remarkable children, and a life richer than I ever imagined possible. The best decision I ever made was to get on that horse. The second best was to never leave her side after that day. Sarah stood and moved into his arms, and their children and grandchildren, yes, there were grandchildren now. Tommy Jr. had married and had 2 little ones of his own, cheered and applauded. Jake held his wife close and thought about all the rides he had taken in his life, all the miles covered and dangers faced. None of it compared to that one desperate journey through the Texas heat with his heart in his throat and hope in his hands. As the party continued around them, Sarah looked up at Jake. No regrets. She asked softly, not a single one, Jake said. You only that I was sick and do not remember more of that ride, Sarah said with a smile. It would have been nice to watch you be so heroic, Jake laughed. There was nothing heroic about it. It was just love, Sarah repeated. As if love is a small thing, it is everything, Jake said. It is the only thing that matters. They danced that night, moving slowly to music played by a hired band, surrounded by the people they loved and who loved them in return. Jake held Sarah close and remembered the fear, remembered the dust and heat and desperate prayer. He remembered the moment her fever had broken, the first time she had said she loved him, the way she had looked walking toward him in the church on their wedding day. Most of all, he remembered the feeling of her hand in his that first night, the way holding on to her had felt like holding on to life itself. That had not changed. After 30 years of marriage, countless challenges faced and overcome, children raised and grandchildren welcomed, that fundamental truth remained. Sarah was his life, his heart, his home. Saving her had been instinct, but loving her had been choice, one he had made every single day for 30 years, and would continue to make for as long as breath remained in his body. The party ended in the small hours of the morning, and Jake and Sarah returned to their house, the one they had built all those years ago and expanded as their family grew. They stood on the porch, looking out over the darkened ranch, the buildings and corrals dim shapes against the star-filled sky. 30 years, Sarah said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. I know exactly what you mean, Jake said. She turned to him, her face soft in the starlight. Thank you for saving my life, Jake Mercer. Thank you for giving me a reason to, Jake replied. Before you, I was just going through the motions. You made me want to really live. They went inside together to the bedroom they had shared for 3 decades, and Jake held Sarah as she fell asleep, her breathing deep and even, alive and well in his. He thought about the young cowboy who had once been afraid to speak his feelings, who had thought he needed to wait for the perfect time. That man would have missed everything that mattered. Life, Jake had learned, did not wait for perfect moments. It demanded courage and action and the willingness to risk everything for what mattered most. He had found that courage on a dusty Texas plain, pushing a tired horse toward a desperate hope, and it had given him everything he had ever wanted and things he had not known enough to dream of. As he drifted towards sleep, his arms around his wife, Jake thought about legacy, about what they would leave behind. There was the ranch, yes, and the children who would carry on after them. But more than that, there was the story of a love that had overcome fear and distance, illness and hardship. There was the example of two people who had found each other and held on through everything life threw at them. The thought crossed his mind, as it sometimes did, of that terrible moment when Tommy had found him on the range with news of Sarah's illness. In a different world, he might have hesitated or waited. He might have thought of himself first, of the danger or the difficulty. But the thought of leaving, of not going to her, had never even occurred to him. It had been as natural as breathing to get on his horse and ride. That, Jake thought as sleep claimed him, was what love was. Not grand gestures or poetic words, though those had their place. But the absolute certainty that when someone you loved needed you, you went. You did not hesitate, you did not calculate the cost. You simply went, because being anywhere else was impossible. He had ridden 30 miles through dust to bring her medicine, and he had never once thought about leaving. That ride had lasted hours, but the love that had driven it would last forever, echoing through the generations that came after them, a reminder that some things were worth any sacrifice, any hardship, any risk. Jake Mercer died peacefully in his sleep in 1925 at the age of 68, with Sarah holding his hand. He had lived to see all 4 of his children grown and successful, to hold 9 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. The ranch he and Sarah had built from nothing had become a thriving multi-generational operation that would continue for decades after his passing. Sarah lived another 7 years, remaining on the ranch surrounded by family until her death in 1932 at the age of 72. To the end, she told anyone who would listen about the cowboy who had loved her enough to ride 30 miles through burning heat without a second thought, who had stayed by her bedside and confessed his love when he thought he might lose her. She wore the cameo brooch Jake had given her on their 10th anniversary every day, and she was buried with it, along with a dried flower from her wedding bouquet that Jake had pressed and kept for her. The story of Jake and Sarah Mercer became part of local legend, told and retold in Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory. The ride, the medicine, the love that had grown from that desperate day, it captured people's imaginations and hearts. It became a touchstone, a reminder of what real love looked like in action. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually work the same land Jake and Sarah had claimed in 1883, riding the same trails, mending fences along the same boundaries. The original house Jake had built still stood, preserved as a family landmark, a shrine to the love that had built an empire. And on hot summer days, when the Texas sun beat down mercilessly and the dust rose in clouds across the plains, the descendants of Jake and Sarah Mercer would pause in their work and think about their great-great-grandfather, who had ridden 30 miles through heat and dust with medicine and hope, who had never once considered turning back, who had saved the woman he loved, and in doing so had created a legacy that would endure for generations. It was a good story, a true story, a love story in the best sense of the word. It was a story about courage and commitment, about the moment when fear falls away and only love remains. It was a story about 2 people who found each other and held on through illness and hardship, through the building of a life from dust and determination. Most of all, it was a story about a simple truth that Jake and Sarah had understood and lived, that love is not just a feeling but a choice and an action. It is getting on a horse when someone needs you. It is riding through whatever stands between you and them. It is staying when leaving would be easier. It is fighting for life and love and hope with everything you have. Jake Mercer had ridden 30 miles through dust to bring Sarah medicine, and he had never once thought about leaving. That single act had set the course for everything that followed, for the family that grew from their love, for the ranch that prospered under their joint stewardship, for the example they left for everyone who came after. And in the end, that was everything. That was legacy. That was love.